Hey there, everybody. Alec Chrisman here, your relevant TA for POLI 231, Intro to Political Theory. I don't normally like recording another video and sending it out so close to the previous one, but then I saw this morning that the paper topics had been sent out, and so I wanted to record this video, especially since the papers are due February 4th, 2021 at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's coming up. That's coming up a week from Thursday, I think it is, a week from this Thursday. And so for people who wanted to get a start on things early, I figured I should record this video of paper writing tips to help out so you have a resource going into it. And by the way, if this is your first ever political theory paper, your first ever paper writing something that's kind of this abstract, starting early isn't a bad idea. You're going to run into some problems that you don't run into on a lot of other papers of sorts that you might be more used to writing. So think about that. I wanted to get this video out. Before we do that, though, I have a couple housekeeping things I want to take care of. As I anticipated, the original video that I posted is already out of date. For whatever reason, my discussion groups and only my discussion groups were set to be 5 hours long on the discussion boards when every other TA's discussion groups were supposed to be 6 hours long. That has since been corrected, and what has happened is whatever your time slot was, it's now extended by 1 hour. So if your time slot, on whatever day it was, ran from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m., it now runs from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., all numbers Eastern Standard Time. If your discussion previously ran from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., it now runs from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is all reflected on the boards. All the numbers up on the board should be correct by now, but I just wanted to say it with my own voice. Hopefully, it'll get across by another method that way. You got that extra hour of wiggle room to work with. If you're coming in that last hour, though, to remember, try to comment on an existing thread or join an existing conversation. A lot of orphan threads happen in that last hour, and those just aren't the most useful for you to nail down the material and learn what you can learn. Another little bit of housekeeping thing before we hop in, group office hours. I've had a couple students tell me they can't make it to the group office hours, yet they still find them very useful. They asked about recording them, possibly. Now, group office hours are an experiment for me this term. I didn't do them last term. I only did individual office hours. But a lot of students like the idea of group office hours because it allows them to hear questions that they wouldn't have thought to ask, right? So I'm just going to ask right now, would you be okay, people, with me recording those group office hours? If you could send me an email letting me know if you'd be okay with it, or more importantly, if you'd be uncomfortable with it, and if you intend to attend. Those would be really useful bits of information to me to understand how popular these things might be, and if they are popular, is the idea of having them recorded going to prevent people from participating fully? That's what I care about most. I care about you feeling comfortable to come in and talk and be open with that. Given that it's group, maybe it's not as much of a concern, other people hearing what you have to say. And of course, they'd only be recorded and used for this course. I would only post them on my courses. I wouldn't post anything that you folks did with your faces in it to my YouTube channel. That's just for my use. But I wanted to ask, so how do you feel about that? Fire off an email. Let me know. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. We're going to move into papers. I'm going to say it one more time. Papers are due February 4th, 2021 at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Little bit of a tip with that. Just give yourself some wiggle room so you're not turning it in at, 4:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I learned last term that there are a lot of issues that my courses can have when everybody's trying to submit their paper all at once. So just for your own sake and the sake of not having to email us afterwards and explain and apologize, do all that stuff, just imagine that the paper's due at 4:30 p.m. Just shoot for that. You might miss it by a bit, but then hopefully we get a decent spread of papers being handed in from 4 to 5. That would be a nice range and it wouldn't overload the system. So that's just a bit of advice. But again, up until 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, that's all good and legit. Now, I'm going to give some paper writing advice of my own, but the biggest advice I'm going to give you is Professor Muniz-Fraticelli has already posted guides by Professor Alison McQueen and Professor Jacob Levy on how to write a political theory paper. Read both of these right now. If you're watching this video and you've got time, pause it and go read those. Those are incredibly, incredibly useful guides. I've been to a conference with Professor McQueen. She is brilliant, and it's a very useful and actionable guide for students. And the times I've taught this course previously, I've always taught them with Professor Levy, so I'm very familiar with his standards. that's what I would say. If you want it to be extra safe, and since you're playing to me when you're writing papers, and my other colleagues who also work for Professor Levy, maybe prioritize Professor Levy's guide a little bit more. They're both good and they work well with each other. There's no contradiction. But if you only read one, that might be the one to read, just because it's the standards that we're most familiar with for grading papers and for judging a good paper. So definitely read both. But if you can only read one, I would suggest reading Professor Levy's. And let's see. The other thing that's important is, so it's not just those standards. I also spoke with Professor Victor Muniz-Fraticelli today, and I asked him sort of what his specific take on paper grading and on undergrad papers were. What are the things that he valued and he wanted me to emphasize in grading? And I'm going to go over a couple of those with you, as well as just general stuff that I've learned from grading papers for the multiple times I've taught this course. So the first one being the two Professor Muniz-Fraticelli's main issues are lack of intellectual charity and equivocation. Now, those words are too big. Let's break those down a little bit. Equivocation. We'll go with that one first. The way to put this is you need to have an argument that is yours, that is clearly yours. You are taking this position and considering alternatives, but defending your position. That's the way to think about this. Equivocation in this case would be, I'm going to argue that X, Y, and Z is true, but it also might be the case that A, B, and C might be true. For instance, taking the first paper topic, maybe Socrates agrees with Creon, but also maybe he doesn't. That's not going to get you a good paper. You need to decide going in, does Socrates agree with Creon, or doesn't he? Or is there a third option that we don't know, but whatever that third option is, that's your thesis. Stick with that thesis. Don't sell it out. Don't pretend like there's another option that might just as well equally be true. Then you're just throwing out ideas. You're not actually making a consistent argument for an argumentative essay. So that's one of Professor Muniz-Fraticelli's big pet peeves, and it's one of my big pet peeves, to be perfectly honest. We need to know what you think, preferably, certainly by the end of the first paragraph, preferably within the first couple sentences of the first paragraph. So that's what I would say with that. Let's see, got my notes over here. And the other one, lack of charity. That would be, it's very easy to assume that you've made one good critique of whatever argument you're criticizing or whatever position isn't yours, and then you just immediately knock it out. It's done. I've defeated Socrates. I've defeated anybody who ever interprets Socrates this way. Creon is obviously right. I'm done. These sorts of arguments don't lend themselves to that. These are, if you write a good paper, you will be presenting multiple different, hard to adjudicate ways of interpreting the prompt and multiple different answers that interpret the prompt, and then telling me which one you pick and why yours is right. You tell me which one you pick, you then put it against multiple other examples, other options. They don't necessarily need to be full-on counter-arguments, like it doesn't have to be directly opposed to what your thesis is, but it needs to at least be different than what your thesis is, and then you tell me why your thesis is still correct. That's what we're trying to get you to do. A paper that never deals with any alternatives, a paper that just says, this is why I'm right, and this is more of why I'm right, and here's another argument showing why I'm right, and here's a fifth argument showing why I'm right, and oops, I'm already out of the word limit, that's also not going to get you a very good grade on these papers. So keep that in mind. Show that you know that you might be wrong. Show that you know that your argument might not be perfectly correct. You show that by showing other possible arguments and then defending your argument, your thesis, as being true nonetheless. So you can see there's kind of a Scylla and Charybdis thing going on between these two sorts of positions. On the one hand, if you're not confident in your position, you're just going to say, oh, my position might be right, but it also might be wrong. Who could know? That's not going to work. And on the other side, if you're too confident in your position such that you never address or deal with any counter-arguments or any possible alternatives, that's also not going to be good enough. You need to stake a strong position, consider strong counter-arguments or strong alternatives to it, and then tell me why your position is right at the end of the day. That's a tricky balance, and we can get more into that in office hours. I'd love to get more into that in office hours. But that's the basic structure. That's the middle path between those two extremes that you're trying to walk. Relatedly, and this ties in with that second point, if you attack another argument or another thinker, you need to give that thinker or that argument room to defend itself in your paper. You need to then go, see, I've attacked position X, but this is why position X might be right, and this is why position X, how position X would critique my position. But my position is ultimately correct. If you attack a position and you never give that other position or that other thinker a chance to respond to you in the word limit, and keep in mind, this is a tight word limit, you're going to have to write really efficiently. If you never give them a chance to respond, you will get graded down for that. I double-checked that with Professor Muniz-Fraticelli, and he said that was very, very important. Let's see. Another thing, don't let that requirement scare you away from making critiques of other positions. You know, there's going to be a temptation to say, as long as I never critique anybody, I never have to give them space in my paper. But good theses that you believe in, good theses that answer the prompt in an interesting way, that make interesting use of the text to answer the prompt, those theses will often require you to critique other interpretations. And don't shy away from that just because you think it's going to be extra work. It's going to be extra work. But if you do it well, if you start practicing doing it well, it's going to show up in your grade. So I would advise you to take that bull by the horns, really take that challenge on board. Let's see, dealt with alternatives, come back to defending your thesis by the end of the paper, perfect. Another thing, this is one of more my kind of pet peeves, but it's a problem I see in a lot of undergrad papers, first-year undergrad theory papers. Don't slow play me. And here's what I mean by slow play me. There's a sort of paper where a person, on purpose or accidentally, makes their thesis deliberately weak, so they have to deal with a weaker counterargument, and then they can then easily dismiss that counterargument. An example of this might be, let's imagine I'm arguing that there's a duty to disobey the government. This is not one of our paper topics, but it might come up later. Let's say I'm arguing that there is, or I argue that there's a duty to obey the government. Let's say that. And then I say there's a duty to obey the government. That's the way it works. And then I bring in a counterargument that says, no, there's no duty to obey the government because the government doesn't truly represent us. Fine counterargument against the original thesis. And then I come in at the end and I say, okay, that's fine, but my argument then is that there's a duty to obey the government if it's properly representative. See how I just changed the argument in the end in order to win the argument and knock aside that counterargument really easily? It turns out my true thesis was, you have a duty to obey the government if the government is properly representative. But I didn't say that. I held that until the end. And that's a really interesting thing to do. It's a really common thing to do, especially if you're not totally confident about your thesis ahead of time. The way to do this best is come up with a thesis that answers the prompt, then think of counterarguments or objections to that thesis, and then realize if that makes you change your thesis, then go back and change your thesis, and then see if you changing the thesis adds and requires different counterarguments. Because if I change my thesis, if my thesis is now, we have a duty to obey the government if it's properly representative, maybe the counterargument is, well, okay, maybe it's, how do we know that it's properly representative? Or what if the government isn't totally representative, but it provides stability? What then? And then if that changes my thesis, then change your thesis and go back, run this process again and again until you find the thesis that's strongest, the best possible argument you can make in response to the prompt. And then, hopefully, the counterarguments you'll come up to in response to that will be the best possible counterarguments, or the best possible alternatives. And then you can come up with the best possible response to and defense of your thesis in light of those best possible counterarguments and alternatives. It's a multi-step process, but the point is, if your thesis changes over the course of the paper, don't just send it in. Go back, change your thesis at the start of the paper, and if that requires you to rewrite the paper, hopefully you can do this all in the outlining phase so you don't need to rewrite the entire paper after you've started writing it. Another really good reason to get started writing these early, and to come to office hours with some ideas and maybe an outline ready to hash out with me, right? A light outline, I can't read a whole outline, I certainly can't read whole paper drafts, but that's a good idea on how to get a jump on this paper and get yourself in a really strong position. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, because again, I've talked too long here, we're going to move back to the question of ripped from the headlines examples, controversial examples, examples that exist in modern politics and that a lot of people argue over. I got an email just today asking if it was okay to use those in the paper. The answer is going to be the same answer that I give for discussion boards, but for different reasons. There are different risks associated. The answer is you are absolutely permitted to use controversial modern-day examples in the papers that you write. In fact, more so on your papers, your thesis might demand that you use some modern-day examples to make it obvious what you're talking about and make it obvious the nature of your argument and what your argument requires. The risk, however, is a little different in a paper than it is on the discussion boards. On the discussion boards, the reason you should be careful using modern controversial examples is just the danger of it devolving into a flame war. It's just the danger of people starting to debate the modern controversial issue rather than the thinkers that were there to discuss. In papers, the risk is a little different. In papers, the risk is that you take your interpretation of the modern controversial example, and you assume that it's inherently obvious without needing to argue for it. You might think that President Donald Trump is obviously a fascist, or President Joe Biden is obviously a socialist. Sorry to pull from American examples, but the student who asked the question was American, I think. Under that circumstance, you might think that's completely obvious, but given that the election between them was pretty closely decided, that's not something you can just drop in your paper as though everyone who's reading your paper will agree with it. It is okay to argue these big controversial positions, but you'll need to actually argue for them. You'll need to say, these are my reasons for thinking that controversial example X should be read in way Y. This is my reason for thinking Donald Trump is a fascist. This is my reason for thinking Joe Biden is a socialist. And now that I've made that argument to you, here's how this argument aids and brings along my ultimate thesis. You can't just assume. A good rule of thumb is if it's hotly debated, that means that it's not obvious. It might be obvious to everyone you know. It might be obvious to even most people in this class with you. But that doesn't mean that it's obvious, and a good paper is going to take the fact of controversy into account. So feel free to use modern controversial rip from the headlines examples. Just be aware that you might have to prove something that you think is obvious. You might have to at least argue for, it's not really a realm for proof, right, again, but you might have to argue for something that you think is really obvious and give a couple reasons for why you interpret the modern controversial thing that way. So, again, if you have any more specific questions on this stuff, my office hours are coming up on Thursday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. for the group office hours, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. for the individual office hours, maybe running a little longer, so stick around if you're in that queue. But yeah, this is a good setup, I think, just to get the ball rolling with this. I'm going to do another one of these videos after I grade the first round of papers, because you never know, every class has different individual issues, different things that come up, but this is a good starting point. Again, I'll say it one more time, read Professor Levy's, read Professor McQueen's resources for how to write a political theory paper. They're incredibly useful and incredibly detailed. That'll get you off on the right foot in regard to this assignment, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you on Thursday, everybody. Cheers.